just some cute academic exercise, that it really does shape the way you see things. Hillary Clinton, about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when she was a senator, came to Israel, went to Bethlehem. She's standing in front of the wall. It's a 26-foot concrete wall in Bethlehem, and said to the press, "This fence is an appropriate, nonviolent response to terrorism." Wow, standing in front of the wall. So this framing issue is really, I mean, how you can look at the wall and call it an appropriate, nonviolent response to an offense shows you how much framing can influence things. So that Israel's a victim and it's fighting for its existence. And then you get into the other things. The land of Israel belongs to us, there's no other people, and there is no occupation. Israel formally denies that it has an occupation. This is the land of Israel. How do you occupy your own country? You see? And you will never, ever, ever hear a pro-Israeli or an Israeli spokesperson use the word occupation. Well, if you decontextualize and depoliticize the discourse to a point where you don't use the... Now, look at what we've talked about. There are no Palestinians. It's just Arabs. There is no Palestine. It's the land of Israel. There's no West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There are no settlements. We don't use the word settlements in Israel. We call them communities, right? And there's no occupation. What do you talk about? You talk about terrorism. You see, and that's how it works. So we have to reframe. And I want to suggest 4 elements of a reframing. First of all, the occupation is at the center of the discussion. I'm not saying the occupation is everything, especially now. Actually, you know, there's more and more people thinking that the term occupation is becoming dated, because what's happened now is going beyond occupation. In other words, if occupation is a temporary military situation, well, we're 43 years on. You know, there's 500,000 Israelis in the occupied territories. Is this still an occupation? So that there's a very interesting, if you want to read it, it's 300 pages, very interesting, a study done by a South African group that's entitled Occupation, Colonialism, Apartheid. And what they're arguing is we should go beyond the word occupation, and we should talk about colonialism, and we should talk about apartheid, not only because of the reality that now we've got, basically, we're talking about not just an occupation, but a system-wide form of apartheid that goes from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. You can't really separate out the occupied territories from the rest of the country. Then maybe we should start to adopt a language that reflects that wider reality. And the point they make is that occupation is not illegal. It's not now, Israel's doing illegal things in the occupation that violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. But colonialism and apartheid are both forms of oppression in which there are actual international laws. It's illegal to be a colonial power. It's illegal to have an apartheid state. There's what's called in international law the crime of apartheid. That's the name of it, officially in international law. So to some degree, we have to begin to think about broadening our talk about occupation to include wider issues of colonialism and apartheid. But we can't not use the word occupation either, because there is an occupation, and we have to be careful not to deflect attention as well from the realities on the ground. So at least at a minimum, we have to have people say the occupation is at the center of the discussion. If you're not going to use the word occupation, I don't want to talk to you. There's nothing to talk about, you see? And if I can get you to use the word occupation, then that changes the entire dynamics of the discussion. Now I've captured the logic, because there's only one occupying power. And now there's a power differential. You can't talk about both sides anymore, you see? And right away, we've captured, we've begun to define the terms differently, the issues differently, and we capture the logic of the discussion. Second of all, what we have to show, and I do this with maps and you know, all our materials that many of you know, is that the occupation is proactive. It is not defensive. The way Israel presents it, that everything we're doing is for self-defense against terrorism. No. There is nothing, I'll go this far to say this, there is nothing that Israel does in the occupied territories that has anything to do with security. You can't explain the demolition of 24,000 Palestinian homes by security. And Israel doesn't even try. It doesn't grant building permits. It demolishes Palestinian homes in military invasions as a kind of collateral damage or as a collective punishment. But it doesn't, Israel itself doesn't explain it in terms of security. You can't explain the uprooting of 1.5 million olive and fruit trees by security. You can't explain the building of 150 settlements by security. And again, Israel doesn't claim a security element in building settlements. This is a proactive claim to the entire country. You can't explain the economic closure. You can't explain the crazy route of the wall by security. In other words, the security framing of Israel doesn't explain anything. That's why for us the house demolition issue is so powerful, because when we tell the stories of these families and show people the demolition, we ask the question, why is this family's house being demolished? And nobody, I can say this in front of the most rabidly pro-Israel crowd, nobody can come back at me and say because they're terrorists, or for security, or Israel's defending itself. No. And it forces them to begin to think, well, wait a minute, maybe really something else is going on that I haven't heard about, that they're not saying. That's when the first slide begins to come into the picture. You begin to go back and say, wait a minute, what's really going on here? Third, Israel is the strong party in the conflict. It is not the victim. And, you know, Israel is a state, it's an occupying power. I'm writing a book now on Israel's involvement in the world's arms trade. I mean, Israel is a tremendously strong country. You know, Israel is the third largest arms exporter in the world. Israel exports more arms than Britain or China. And I think in the BDS campaigns, and I've suggested this in different forums, that in the BDS campaigns, I think we should focus also on the arms issue. People don't know, the United States, in the last hours of the Bush administration, promised $30 billion of new arms to Israel over the next 10 years. You know, and this is at a time when your whole educational system is falling apart. So in the framing, we have to kind of link up to local concerns and so on, but presenting Israel as a strong party, and that's why it's so afraid of the Goldstone report. That's why it's so afraid of getting hauled before the International Court of Justice over the wall. Not because it fears sanctions. The United States is not going to allow sanctions, but because people begin to see Israel as a bully, as a strong party, and as a major violator of human rights. Wow, does that reframe Leon Uris's Exodus? Right? And if Israel can be seen as a strong party, then it can be held accountable for what it does under international law. Then the immunity of being the victim disappears, and you can hold Israel accountable. And in fact, any solution has to be based on human rights and international law. Let me end this with the third part of it. So now we get to the solutions. Because like I said, the solutions flow from the way you've framed the concept, or the conflict, right? So if you accept Israel's security framing, if in fact Arabs are our permanent enemies, they're just terrorists, we're in a clash of civilizations where they're not the civilized side, and all of that, you're not going to get to a two-state solution. Because why would you give your enemies a state in the belly of your own country, 10 miles from Ben Gurion Airport? It would be stupid. If I believed the Israeli framing, I would want to build a 100-foot wall, not a 26-foot wall, because these are my enemies permanently. But on the other hand, if you reframe and you accept Israeli accountability and Palestinian national rights and international law and human rights and talk about occupation and so on, you're not going to get to apartheid as a solution. I mean, the solution has to be logically connected to your argument. And therefore, what I'm saying is what gives the Israeli argument and its policies and its arguing, what gives AIPAC the ability to argue so effectively in Congress is because they hear the Israeli framing, the security framing. And therefore, this makes sense. If, in fact, the Arabs are our permanent enemies, then any solution, I don't care if it's two states or whatever it is, any solution has to leave Israel in control of the entire country. Right? I mean, to ask anything less than that would be suicidal. Second of all, the most Israel can offer the Palestinians, and this is a very interesting phrase. This is something that Netanyahu was the first one to really articulate in a way the Israeli conception, give it a name. He was once asked by journalists, where are you going with this whole thing? More settlements and more highways and more expropriation of Palestinian land and more oppression and the attacks and military. Where are you going with all of this? And Netanyahu gave this formula. He says, we'll give the Palestinians independence minus, autonomy plus. Well, somewhere in between. And they asked him, give us an example. And you know what he said? Andorra. Now, I don't know how many people here know where Andorra is. And I don't know who told Netanyahu about Andorra. But Andorra is a little principality in the Pyrenees between France and Spain. It's a German-speaking place that's not connected at all to Germany or German-speaking countries, that belongs to France. It's like Monaco. It belongs to France, but the head of state of Andorra is a bishop appointed by Spain. That's Netanyahu's concept of where we're going with some Palestinian entity. And that makes sense in a way if, in fact, Israel has to keep control of the whole country. And the best we can do is a Bantustan. And apartheid is where Ulmert was going in the and where Sharon was going, and where Barak was going. But even apartheid is too much for Netanyahu. I mean, Netanyahu will give a certain amount of autonomy, but even apartheid is too much for him.